think every speaker approaches with intrepidation as soon as they see the computer. There's nowhere to put the papers or the book. Anyway, I'll do my best. Thank you for your introduction, John, an excellent one. And really what the purpose of my contribution in the few minutes is to emphasize the role that legislators can play in developing an agreement towards Paris and Kyoto. I was a negotiator at Kyoto. I've seen how the top works. I know if you want to get an agreement, you better get it down further below, down to where the legislators are. So I congratulate Mr. Pachari in allowing a section to be that legislators can sit and say what is happening in our countries, because they often say is nothing. John referred to the report of Globe. This is 33 countries. In the next month, we will be producing one for the 66 countries, and you can look up here and see what each country is doing about improving the climate legislation. We really need to get it right at that level, and the legislators can play a part. Legislators in other bodies like the one I'm in, the Council of Europe, last Thursday passed the resolution that I put to them in the report, and it's headed Climate Change, a Framework for Global Agreement. And why is that? And that's why we discussed yesterday. The fears are that agreement by Paris in 2015, which is after the 4-year extension of Kyoto from 2012, means that you must find an agreement. We can't stop the clock. So by Paris, which is about 20 months' time, we must find an agreement that has a legal framework and at the same time recognizes the full principles embodied in the legislation of Kyoto based on really all countries having a more equitable treatment, common but differential responsibilities. That's what has to give us. To get that in 20 months, for countries that are already saying we'll not have an international legal agreement, we still need to have a global agreement, and we need to its local implementation. So what we talked about yesterday, and there were 20 countries represented there, was quite remarkable. I think 5 of the speakers today were also at that debate. And what we're trying to say, and I hope it becomes a permanent part of this conference, that the legislators report back. And in fact, what I want to say, therefore, is hopefully in the next few months after the Lima COP, and the one next year, getting for Paris, we can report to you how far we've got in, carrying the views about sustainability, of which you've connected to the water, the energy and food. And it isn't just about carbon cut, it is about the sustainability of all these parts. That is our definition of sustainability, quite different from Davos. So yesterday when we met with the Indian Parliament's a group of people who've got together, and they told us what was happening in India. And they'll be reporting back to the Globe Summit that we'll be having in Mexico to report back what is happening on the legislative front. So we all discussed that. Everybody agreed that all the consequences of the weather are quite considerable in all their countries, and something needs to be done. There is a changing mood. We've fought the argument of environment on the scientists are cutting carbon, and from them have come a number of problems about whether they can enforce from top down. You really can't. So how can legislators in their own parliaments play a part? If they're able to do what we've done in my country, Mexico is doing, and others, you establish climate change legislation. You set your own program, really, consistent with the program established globally. You decide that. We write into our legislation a carbon targets. Our parliament decides it. But then to make it enforceable, you put it into your laws. We'd like all countries to do that. That is what we are recommending in our alternative program to be discussed at the next conferences for Paris. So the domestic law implements the proposals. It is the parliament of the country that make the decision. But they have to recognize that that is and has to be checked for credibility. It's easy to promise things, we all know, and many of us do, and they get affected by elections. But at the end of the day, if you write it in, as in Australia, to the legislation, the government that's coming in Australia does not agree with the climate change arguments, but they can't change it by just a policy statement. They have to change the legislation. So what I'm trying to leave with you is the idea. One, that we have a domestic framework, a legal framework. We all embody what we think is necessary to do to our economy, along with the scientists telling us we must not exceed a particular target if we want to keep the target of the temperature. So what we decided yesterday and we talked about all these issues, how it can be national and local, and what we said, therefore, what we do is to connect all these things, that we make a report. We take that report, as we are doing with here, to Mexico, when the legislators are going to meet very shortly. We're taking it to Washington, where there's a discussion there in America with the people in America. And these are all our legislators in a parliament discussing how far have we got. We'll be taking it to the UN conference where we're invited to, which is taking place in September by the Secretary General. So legislators can play a more effective part. It's still keeping the basic principles embodied in Kyoto, that there needs to be a legal framework. There's a recognition we should all do to move to a low-carbon economy under the UN principle I've referred to. And we hope then, perhaps if we get the opportunity, we will be able to report back to you next year, and I hope Mr. Pachauri actually keeps this legislative framework in, so we can find out what's happening in other countries, encourage it through Globe organization, which will be able to then put that framework together and report back to you. So for the first time, the legislators have forced their way onto the program. Instead of sitting at home to find out what the government's agreed and then putting our hands up or down whether we agreed with it, we influence the decision. We build up the debate and the climate for change. That's where it's important. And I hope the meeting that we held yesterday was a very important step forward to the New Delhi conference. The real conference on sustainability has a framework that's making a change, not only at the global level, but also at the national level. You need both, and Paris is about that. And perhaps next year, after the Lima conference, we'll be able to report back to you.